Moscow, Sokolniki Park, July 24, 1959, 11:47 a.m. Vice President Richard Nixon stood beneath the geodesic dome of the American National Exhibition, gripping a sweating bottle of Pepsi Cola as flashbulbs erupted around him. Across a kitchen display meant to showcase capitalist abundance, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev jabbed a finger at Nixon's chest, arguing the merits of washing machines and color television sets, while the world's cameras captured what would become known as the kitchen debate. What those cameras didn't capture, what no journalist in that sweltering pavilion could have known, was that the Pepsi bottle in Nixon's hand, and the entire soft drink operation behind it, would become one of the most unlikely and effective intelligence collection platforms the Central Intelligence Agency ever deployed on Soviet soil. The American National Exhibition had been negotiated as part of a cultural exchange agreement signed in the waning months of 1958, a brief thaw in the permafrost of Cold War hostility. The Eisenhower administration saw it as a propaganda opportunity, 6 weeks to display American consumer goods, technology, and lifestyle to Soviet citizens in the heart of Moscow. The exhibition would occupy Sokolniki Park from late July through September, drawing millions of visitors through displays of automobiles, fashion, kitchen appliances, and a full-scale model American home. Among the corporate sponsors was PepsiCo, which had secured the exclusive soft drink concession and planned to distribute free samples to Soviet visitors, a marketing coup that would introduce Pepsi to a market of 200 million potential consumers behind the Iron Curtain. But the Central Intelligence Agency saw something else entirely. They saw foot traffic. They saw controlled access points. They saw a legitimate American commercial operation that would require Soviet citizens to staff it, manage it, and interact with it daily for 6 weeks. They saw, in other words, a perfect recruitment environment disguised as a soda stand. To understand how a soft drink became an intelligence asset, you have to understand the operational constraints the CIA faced in Moscow during the late 1950s. The Soviet Union ran the most comprehensive surveillance state in human history. Every Western diplomat, journalist, and businessman operated under constant KGB observation. Embassy personnel were followed from the moment they left the compound. Their apartments were bugged. Their phone lines were tapped. Their trash was collected and analyzed. Soviet citizens who worked for Western organizations were debriefed regularly by the Second Chief Directorate, the KGB division responsible for counterintelligence on Soviet territory. Making contact with a potential asset without triggering surveillance was nearly impossible. Running an agent inside the Soviet Union required tradecraft so sophisticated, so patient, that most CIA operations in Moscow focused not on active recruitment, but on servicing assets who had volunteered themselves while traveling abroad. The American National Exhibition changed that calculus. For 6 weeks, the CIA would have a legitimate reason to employ Soviet citizens in a controlled American space, to interact with them daily, to build relationships that looked entirely natural to any KGB observer. The Pepsi concession was particularly valuable because it required the most staff: bottlers, distributors, servers, cleaners, inventory managers. PepsiCo needed to hire locally, and the CIA needed PepsiCo to hire the right people. The operation began in March 1959, 4 months before the exhibition opened. A CIA officer named Donald Jameson, operating under diplomatic cover as a cultural affairs attaché at the U.S. Embassy, approached PepsiCo's vice president for international operations, a man named Alfred Steele. Steele was married to actress Joan Crawford and had built his career on aggressive international expansion. He was also a committed anti-communist who had worked with U.S. intelligence during World War II. Jameson's pitch was straightforward. PepsiCo would run its concession exactly as planned. but the agency would provide guidance on hiring decisions. Certain applicants, individuals already identified by CIA as having access to sensitive information or positions within Soviet institutions, would be prioritized for employment. In exchange, PepsiCo would receive full U.S. government support for its Soviet market ambitions, including diplomatic pressure on trade restrictions and favorable financing for future bottling plants. Steele agreed. The arrangement was formalized in a memorandum that was never filed with PepsiCo's board and was classified top secret no foreign nationals. The agency's role would remain invisible. PepsiCo's Moscow hiring manager, a Soviet citizen named Viktor Kuznetsov, who had been cleared by the KGB to work with American companies, received his applicant list from the Soviet Ministry of Culture. What Kuznetsov didn't know was that the CIA had already penetrated the ministry's personnel office through a low-level clerk who had been recruited 2 years earlier during a trade mission to Brussels. The clerk, codenamed Compass, provided the agency with the full list of applicants 3 weeks before Kuznetsov received it. The CIA cross-referenced every name against their existing files on Soviet military personnel, intelligence officers, scientists, and government officials. They found 12 individuals of immediate interest. Among them was a 31-year-old woman named Svetlana Dmitrievna Petrova. Svetlana's file was thin but promising. Born in Leningrad in 1928, she had studied English and French at Leningrad State University, graduating in 1950 with honors. Her father, Dmitry Petrov, had been a Red Army colonel who died during the siege of Leningrad when Svetlana was 13. Her mother, Ekaterina, worked as a translator at the Leningrad Institute of Precision Mechanics and Optics, a research facility that developed guidance systems for Soviet ballistic missiles. Svetlana herself had worked as a translator at the institute from 1951 to 1956, handling technical documentation for foreign equipment purchases and scientific exchanges. In 1956, she married a Soviet Air Force engineer named Yuri Volkov and moved to Moscow when he was assigned to the Ministry of Aviation Industry. The marriage had been troubled. Neighbors reported arguments, and Yuri was rumored to have a drinking problem. Svetlana had applied to work at the American exhibition, she wrote in her application, because she wanted to practice her English and earn extra money. Her husband's salary, she noted, was insufficient for their needs. The CIA saw several exploitable vulnerabilities: financial stress, marital discord, access through her mother to a sensitive military research facility, and her own background handling classified technical documents. She was exactly the kind of target the agency looked for, not a committed ideologue, but someone under pressure, someone who might be persuaded that cooperation offered a way out. Donald Jameson made sure Svetlana Petrova was hired. She was assigned to the Pepsi pavilion as a senior server and translator, responsible for explaining the product to Soviet visitors and managing the sample distribution process. Her shift ran from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., 6 days a week. She would work alongside 4 other Soviet employees and 2 American PepsiCo representatives, who were, in fact, CIA officers operating under commercial cover. The exhibition opened on July 24, 1959, the same day Nixon and Khrushchev staged their impromptu debate. Over the next 6 weeks, more than 2.7 million Soviet citizens passed through Sokolniki Park. The Pepsi Pavilion became one of the most popular attractions, with lines stretching hundreds of meters as Muscovites waited for their first taste of American cola. Svetlana worked those lines with practiced efficiency, pouring samples into small paper cups, answering questions about ingredients and production methods, smiling through the exhaustion of 12-hour shifts during peak days. The CIA officers watched her carefully. They noted that she was punctual, meticulous, and slightly reserved with her Soviet co-workers, but warmed considerably when speaking English with American visitors. She asked thoughtful questions about life in the United States, not the scripted propaganda questions KGB informants typically deployed, but genuine curiosity about housing costs, educational opportunities, and whether it was true that Americans could travel freely between states without internal passports. On her third day, one of the CIA officers, a man using the name Robert Harper, complimented her English and asked where she had learned to speak so fluently. Svetlana mentioned her university studies and her work at the Precision Mechanics Institute. Harper expressed interest. He had a background in engineering, he said, and was fascinated by Soviet technical achievements. The conversation lasted 4 minutes before the next rush of visitors arrived. Over the following 2 weeks, Harper engineered a dozen similar interactions, each one brief and natural, each one building rapport. He learned about her father's death, her mother's work, her husband's frustrations with the Soviet aviation bureaucracy. He mentioned, casually, that he had friends in the U.S. State Department who sometimes helped Soviet citizens with family reunification cases or educational exchanges. He never pushed. He simply planted seeds. The approach came on August 14, 1959, during Svetlana's lunch break. Harper found her sitting alone on a bench near the pavilion, eating a sandwich she had brought from home. He sat down, offered her a fresh Pepsi from the cooler, a small luxury since employees were rationed to 1 bottle per shift, and asked if she had ever considered visiting the United States. Svetlana laughed. On her salary? Impossible. Harper nodded sympathetically. Then he said something that changed the trajectory of her life. What if there was a way to make that possible? Not immediately, but eventually. A way to build a future that didn't depend on your husband's salary or the ministry's approval. Svetlana's expression shifted. She set down her sandwich. What are you talking about? Harper spoke carefully, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the bench. He explained that he worked for an organization that helped people in difficult situations, people who had valuable knowledge or access and were willing to share information in exchange for financial security and eventually resettlement opportunities. He emphasized that this was not about betraying the Soviet Union, but about securing her own future and her mother's future. He mentioned a specific figure, $5,000 deposited in a Swiss bank account in her name, in exchange for technical documents her mother could access at the Precision Mechanics Institute. The documents would be photographed and returned within 24 hours. No one would know. The risk was minimal. The reward was life-changing. Svetlana stared at him for a long moment. Then she stood up, walked back to the pavilion, and resumed her shift without saying another word. Harper reported the contact to Jameson that evening. The assessment was inconclusive. Svetlana hadn't rejected the offer outright, but she hadn't accepted it either. The decision was made to wait. Pushing too hard would spook her, or worse, prompt her to report the approach to the KGB. The exhibition had 3 weeks remaining. They would give her time to think. Svetlana returned to work the next day and the day after that, maintaining her professional demeanor, saying nothing to Harper beyond the necessary pleasantries. But on August 19th, during another lunch break, she approached him. She asked quietly what kind of documents he was interested in. Harper provided a list, technical specifications for the RT-2 ballistic missile guidance system, blueprints for the inertial navigation platform, procurement records for foreign components. Svetlana said she would need to think about it. Harper gave her a phone number, a payphone near Gorky Park that was checked twice daily by a CIA officer. If she decided to proceed, she should call and ask for Mikhail. She should say she was interested in purchasing American records. That would be the signal. The call came on August 23rd. Svetlana used a public phone booth near her apartment building at 7:15 p.m., a time when the KGB's surveillance resources were stretched thin across multiple priority targets. She asked for Mikhail. She said she was interested in purchasing American records. The officer on the other end confirmed the message and hung up. The operation was active. The first exchange occurred on August 27th. Svetlana's mother, Ekaterina, worked late shifts at the institute and had access to the technical library where classified documents were stored overnight for translation and distribution. Ekaterina was not read into the operation. Svetlana told her mother she was helping a friend who worked in the aviation industry and needed reference materials for a project. Ekaterina, trusting her daughter and accustomed to the informal exchanges of documents that occurred regularly in Soviet technical circles, borrowed 3 files on the RT-2 guidance system and brought them home in her briefcase. Svetlana met Harper at a prearranged location, the Tretyakov Gallery, a public museum where surveillance was lighter and foot traffic provided cover. She carried the files in a canvas shopping bag beneath a layer of vegetables and bread, a common sight in Moscow where shortages meant citizens carried groceries whenever they found them. Harper carried an identical bag. They passed each other in the gallery's icon room, pausing briefly to admire a 15th-century depiction of St. George slaying the dragon. In that moment, the bags were switched. Harper left the gallery immediately and delivered the files to a CIA safe house in the Arbat district, where a technical officer photographed each page using a Minox camera. The files were returned to Svetlana at a second exchange point, a bench in Gorky Park. 18 hours later, Svetlana returned them to her mother that evening. Ekaterina brought them back to the institute the next morning. No one noticed they had been gone. The operation continued through September. Svetlana facilitated 4 more exchanges, each one yielding documents on Soviet missile technology, radar systems, and aviation engineering. The CIA paid her in cash, delivered in small increments to avoid suspicion, $200 at a time, hidden in envelopes tucked inside American magazines that Harper gave her as gifts at the Pepsi pavilion. By the time the exhibition closed on September 4th, Svetlana had received $1,800 and had been promised the full $5,000 upon delivery of a final set of documents. The complete technical manual for the RT-2's inertial guidance platform, a document her mother could access during the Institute's annual inventory review in late September. But the KGB had been watching. Not Svetlana specifically, at least not at first. The second chief directorate had assigned surveillance teams to monitor all Soviet employees at the American exhibition as a matter of routine counterintelligence procedure. Most of the monitoring was passive: periodic debriefings, reviews of phone records, occasional physical surveillance. But one of the KGB officers assigned to the Pepsi pavilion, a captain named Grigory Suslov, had noticed something unusual. Svetlana Petrova had been observed speaking extensively with Robert Harper, one of the American PepsiCo representatives. The conversations were always brief and appeared innocuous, but their frequency was anomalous. Suslov noted it in his reports, but took no immediate action. Harper's cover was solid, and Svetlana had no prior counterintelligence flags in her file. What triggered the deeper investigation was a bureaucratic accident. In early September, the KGB's 7th Directorate, responsible for surveillance of foreign diplomats and intelligence officers, cross-referenced the names of all American personnel at the exhibition against a list of suspected CIA officers compiled from defector debriefings and signals intelligence. Robert Harper's name appeared on that list. He had been identified by a KGB source in Vienna as a CIA officer operating under commercial cover in Eastern Europe. The information was 2 years old and hadn't been updated in the Central Registry, which was why Harper had been cleared to work at the exhibition. But now the connection was made. Suslov was ordered to initiate full surveillance of Svetlana Petrova effective September 6th, 2 days after the exhibition closed. Her phone was tapped. Her apartment was placed under observation. Her movements were tracked. On September 11th, she was followed to the Tretyakov Gallery, where she was observed making brief contact with a man who was not Robert Harper, but matched the description of another suspected CIA officer. The surveillance team lost the man in the metro, but they recovered Svetlana's shopping bag after she left it briefly unattended on a bench. A standard KGB tactic was to create momentary distractions and search belongings during the confusion. Inside the bag, beneath a layer of groceries, they found a sealed envelope containing $200. Svetlana Petrova was arrested on September 14, 1959, at 6:30 a.m. in her apartment. KGB officers seized the cash, the American magazines, and a notebook in which she had written the phone number for the Gorky Park contact point. Her mother, Ekaterina, was arrested simultaneously at the Precision Mechanics Institute. Both women were taken to Lefortovo prison, the KGB's primary interrogation facility in Moscow. The interrogation of Svetlana lasted 6 weeks. She was not tortured. By 1959, the KGB had largely moved away from Stalinist-era physical coercion in favor of psychological pressure and legal leverage. Instead, she was confronted with the evidence: the cash, the phone number, the surveillance photographs of her meetings with Harper. She was told that her mother faced charges of treason for providing classified documents to a foreign intelligence service, a crime punishable by death under Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code. She was offered a choice: full cooperation, including a detailed confession and agreement to work as a double agent against the CIA, in exchange for leniency for her mother and a reduced sentence for herself. Or silence, which would result in her mother's execution and her own sentence to a labor camp in the Kolyma region, where life expectancy for political prisoners averaged less than 3 years. Svetlana confessed. She provided the KGB with a complete account of her recruitment, the exchanges, the documents she had facilitated, and the identities of the CIA officers she had met. She agreed to continue contact with the CIA under KGB control, passing disinformation and identifying other agency officers operating in Moscow. In exchange, her mother was released after 3 months of detention and allowed to return to work under permanent KGB supervision. Svetlana was sentenced to 8 years in a labor camp, a term that was later reduced to 5 years for her cooperation. Robert Harper and the other CIA officers involved in the operation had already left the Soviet Union by the time Svetlana was arrested. The agency had maintained strict operational security, using false identities and cover documentation that couldn't be traced back to official U.S. personnel. The Soviets protested through diplomatic channels, accusing the United States of using the cultural exhibition as a cover for espionage, but they provided no evidence that could be made public without revealing the extent of their own surveillance apparatus. The incident was buried in classified files on both sides. The documents Svetlana had provided proved valuable. The technical specifications for the RT-2 guidance system allowed U.S. analysts to identify vulnerabilities in Soviet missile accuracy, information that informed American strategic planning throughout the early 1960s. The CIA assessed that the intelligence gained from the operation justified the risks, even accounting for Svetlana's eventual compromise. In the cold arithmetic of espionage, she had been a successful asset. But the human cost was measured differently. Svetlana Petrova served 4 years and 7 months in a labor camp in the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, a facility that housed female political prisoners. She was released in 1964, her health broken, her marriage dissolved. Yuri Volkov had divorced her in absentia and remarried. She returned to Moscow and worked as a cleaning woman in a municipal building, her university education and language skills rendered useless by her criminal record. Her mother, Ekaterina, died in 1967 of a heart attack. Her career at the Precision Mechanics Institute ended by the KGB's permanent surveillance. Svetlana lived until 1982, dying of pneumonia in a communal apartment in the Kuzminki district. She never spoke publicly about her involvement with the CIA. The $5,000 promised to her was never delivered. The Swiss account, if it ever existed, was closed after her arrest. The Pepsi connection, meanwhile, became one of the Cold War's stranger footnotes. PepsiCo's involvement in the CIA operation was never publicly disclosed, and the company successfully expanded into the Soviet market in the 1970s, becoming the first American consumer product widely available behind the Iron Curtain. By 1989, PepsiCo was operating dozens of bottling plants across the Soviet Union and had negotiated a barter deal in which the USSR paid for Pepsi syrup with Stolichnaya vodka and, bizarrely, 17 submarines and a cruiser from the Soviet Navy, which PepsiCo sold for scrap. The company's executives had no knowledge of the 1959 intelligence operation. The arrangement with Jameson and Steele had been compartmentalized so tightly that it existed only in CIA records, which remained classified until partial declassification in 2006 under a Freedom of Information Act request, filed by a historian researching Cold War cultural exchanges. The declassified documents revealed the operational structure, but redacted the names of the assets involved. Svetlana Petrova's identity was confirmed only in 2011, when a former KGB officer named Viktor Cherkashin published a memoir that included a brief account of her case. Cherkashin, who had worked in the Second Chief Directorate during the 1960s, described Svetlana as a tragic figure, a woman who made a desperate choice and paid for it with her life. He noted that the KGB had considered her cooperation genuine and had used her for several months to feed disinformation to the CIA before determining that the Americans had become suspicious and terminated contact. What remains unknown is the full extent of the CIA's use of commercial cover during the Cold War. The Pepsi operation was almost certainly not unique. Declassified documents reference similar arrangements with other American companies operating in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, including IBM, Ford, and Pan American Airways. But the specifics remain classified, protected by corporate confidentiality agreements and national security exemptions that prevent full disclosure even decades after the Cold War's end. The case of Svetlana Petrova and the Pepsi Pavilion illustrates several enduring truths about intelligence work during the Cold War. First, that espionage was often less about dramatic confrontations and more about exploiting mundane opportunities. A soft drink concession, a cultural exhibition, a translator's financial troubles. Second, that the human beings caught in these operations were rarely ideological warriors, but ordinary people under pressure, making choices that seemed rational in the moment and catastrophic in hindsight. Third, that the intelligence agencies on both sides operated with a ruthless pragmatism that treated individuals as expendable assets in a larger strategic game. The Cold War was fought not only with missiles and tanks, but with recruitment pitches delivered over Pepsi bottles, with surveillance teams tracking shopping bags through Moscow galleries, with mothers unknowingly handing classified documents to daughters who had been promised a better life. It was a conflict in which the ordinary and the clandestine were so thoroughly intertwined that a simple act, pouring a cup of cola, sitting on a park bench, carrying groceries, could be simultaneously genuine and operational, innocent and treasonous. Svetlana Petrova's story raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of intelligence recruitment. Was the CIA justified in targeting a woman under financial and marital stress, knowing that her cooperation would likely end in arrest and imprisonment? Was the intelligence gained worth the destruction of her life and her mother's? The agency's internal assessment, documented in a 1961 review, concluded that the operation had been professionally executed within acceptable risk parameters and that Svetlana's recruitment had been voluntary and informed. But the definition of voluntary becomes murky when the alternative to cooperation is poverty and desperation, and informed is questionable when the recruited asset has no realistic understanding of the surveillance capabilities arrayed against her. The KGB, for its part, showed no hesitation in leveraging Svetlana's mother as a coercive tool, threatening execution to secure cooperation. The Soviet system's willingness to punish family members for an individual's crimes was a cornerstone of its counterintelligence strategy, creating a climate of fear that made recruitment of Soviet citizens extraordinarily difficult, but also ensured that those who were recruited faced existential consequences if caught. In the end, the Pepsi operation succeeded in its immediate objective. It produced valuable intelligence on Soviet missile technology that contributed to American strategic assessments during a critical period of the arms race. But it also exemplified the moral compromises inherent in Cold War espionage, the willingness of both superpowers to sacrifice individuals in pursuit of marginal advantages, and the human wreckage left behind when clandestine operations went wrong. The pavilion in Sokolniki Park was dismantled in September 1959, its displays packed into crates and shipped back to the United States. The Pepsi bottles were collected, the banners taken down, the model American home disassembled. Within weeks, the park returned to its normal function as a recreational space for Muscovites, the 6-week exhibition fading into memory. But in the files of the CIA and the KGB, in the prison records of Lefortovo and the labor camps of Mordovia, in the brief, tragic life of Svetlana Dmitrievna Petrova, the operation endured as a reminder of what the Cold War cost the people who lived through it. Not the policymakers and generals, but the translators and engineers, the mothers and daughters. The ordinary citizens who found themselves caught between two systems that valued secrets more than lives. The question that remains, the question that haunts every declassified operation from that era, is whether any intelligence was worth that price. The documents Svetlana provided helped American analysts understand Soviet missile capabilities, but they did not prevent the arms race, did not avert nuclear confrontation, did not bring the Cold War to an earlier end. They were incremental advantages in a conflict that would grind on for another 3 decades, consuming resources, lives, and moral certainty on both sides. Svetlana Petrova died in obscurity, her contribution to American intelligence unknown to her neighbors, her sacrifice unacknowledged by the country she had tried to help. She was one asset among thousands, one case file among millions, one life spent in a war that was never officially declared and never formally won. And yet, her story matters precisely because it was ordinary. The Cold War was not fought primarily by James Bond figures engaging in spectacular confrontations, but by people like Svetlana, people who made desperate choices, who were recruited in moments of vulnerability, who paid with years of their lives for decisions made in minutes. Understanding the Cold War requires understanding not just the geopolitical strategies and nuclear arsenals, but the human mechanisms through which espionage actually functioned. The recruitment pitches, the dead drops, the surveillance, the interrogations, the compromises. It requires recognizing that behind every classified document, every intelligence assessment, every strategic advantage, there were real people whose lives were irrevocably altered by their involvement in the clandestine struggle between East and West. The Pepsi Pavilion was a small operation in the grand scheme of Cold War intelligence, a footnote in the larger history of CIA activities in the Soviet Union. But it was also a perfect microcosm of how that conflict was waged, through the exploitation of cultural exchanges, the recruitment of vulnerable individuals, the patient construction of cover identities, and the ruthless calculation of acceptable losses. It showed how a soft drink company could become an intelligence platform, how a translator's financial troubles could become an operational opportunity, how a mother's access to classified documents could become a weapon in a global struggle. 50 years after the American National Exhibition closed its doors, the Pepsi-Cola Company remains one of the world's most recognized brands, its products sold in nearly every country on Earth. The Cold War is over, the Soviet Union dissolved, the KGB transformed into successor agencies with new acronyms and mandates. But the files remain, the classified documents slowly trickling into public view through declassification reviews and Freedom of Information Act requests, each release adding another piece to the mosaic of how the Cold War was actually fought. Svetlana Petrova's file, when it was finally declassified, ran to 347 pages. It contained surveillance photographs, interrogation transcripts, operational cables, and a final assessment written by the CIA officer who had recruited her. The assessment noted her intelligence, her courage, and her ultimate fate. It concluded with a single sentence that captured the cold logic of espionage during that era. Asset performed as expected until compromise. Operational security maintained throughout. Intelligence product justified expenditure of resources. Resources. That was the word used to describe a human life. A woman's 4 years in a labor camp. A mother's death from a broken heart. Resources expended in pursuit of strategic advantage, in the service of a conflict that consumed millions of lives and trillions of dollars, and ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. The Pepsi bottle that Richard Nixon held in Sokolniki Park on July 24, 1959, became an iconic image of the Cold War, a symbol of American capitalism's appeal behind the Iron Curtain. What the photograph didn't show, what no camera could capture, was the clandestine machinery already in motion beneath that public spectacle. The recruitment operations, the surveillance networks, the human beings being drawn into a secret war that would destroy some of them and leave the rest forever changed. That machinery is what this story is really about. Not the Pepsi, not the kitchen debate, not the propaganda value of soft drinks and washing machines, but the invisible architecture of espionage that turned a cultural exhibition into an intelligence operation, a translator into an asset, and a bottle of cola into a tool of the Cold War. Understanding that machinery, recognizing its human cost, and reckoning with the moral compromises it required, that is the work of history. That is what the declassified files demand of us. That is what Svetlana Petrova's story, and the thousands of stories like it, compel us to remember.